Happy Friday. We're gonna pick up where we left off from Wednesday's class. We're gonna pick up where we left off on Wednesday's class with our historical inquiry. And just a couple reminders before we get started that your participation and your completion of this Ed puzzle and your participation in class on Wednesday count towards your Unit 5 Industrial Revolution test grade, which we will work on next class. So make sure we are watching, listening, reading, and answering all questions. Now, as a refresher, we looked at documents A and B last class. And document A was an interview with Mr. Ward, or Dr. Ward, he was a doctor to many of the children who worked in the factories. He went into the factories and experienced it for himself. And he said that factories are not safe for children. Then we looked at document B with Dr. Holm, and he also was interviewed about working conditions in factories. But he said that factories aren't any worse than any other working place. So he said factories are not bad. However, he did not have as much detail as Dr. Ward in document A. Because if we remember, if we look at this third answer, he said some of them had delicate appearances, were sickly, in bad health. They weren't very specific answers. And he also used information that was 20 years old, because this was written, remember, let me move this out of the way, actually. So if you look at the very bottom, this was written in 1818, and he was using information from 1796. So he was using really old information. And on top of that, Mr. Pulley, the factory owner, paid him to make his factory look good. So he actually kind of lied in his interview because he wanted to make the factory look good, regardless of what it was actually like. Now, before we move into document C, you can also access all of these documents in Canvas, and just click previous and next to access them, and I will link them next to this video. So jumping in to document C. So here is our background information. John Burley was born in London in 1805. He lost both his parents by the age of 5, and he was sent to the Bethnal Green Workhouse. He soon began working at the Cressbrook factory. John was interviewed about his experience as a child worker at the mill in 1849. The article on his life was published in the newspaper, the Ashton Chronicle, in May 1849. Below is an excerpt from the article. So our first question, well, actually, before we get to our first question, we got to read the document. Our regular working time was from 5 in the morning till 9 or 10 at night, and on Saturday till 11, and often 12 o'clock at night. And then we were sent to clean the machinery on the Sunday. No time was allowed for breakfast, and no sitting for dinner, and no time for tea. We went to the mill at 5 o'clock and worked till about 8 or 9, when they brought us our breakfast, which consisted of water porridge with oat cake in it and onions to flavor it. We then worked till 9 or 10 at night. Mr. Needham, the master, had 5 sons: Frank, Charles, Samuel, Robert, and John. The sons and a man named Swan, the overlooker, used to go up and down the mill with sticks. Frank once beat me till he frightened himself. He thought he had killed me. He had struck me on the temples and knocked me dateless. He once knocked me down and threatened me with a stick. To save my head, I raised my arm, which he then hit with all his might. My elbow was broken. I bear the marks and suffer pain from it to this day, and always shall as long as I live. I was determined to let the gentlemen of the Bethnal Green parish know the treatment we had, and I wrote a letter and put it into the post office. Sometime after this, 3 gentlemen came down from London, but before we were examined, we were washed and cleaned up in order to tell them that we liked working at the mill and we were treated well. Needham and his sons were in the room at the time. They asked us questions about our treatment, which we answered as we had been told, not daring to do any other, knowing what would happen if we told them the truth. So our first question, and you might have to look at the background information for this, but it's a 2-part question. Part 1, what type of document is this? And 2, when was it written? And for the second part of the answer, you'll find it at the bottom of the page. All right, question 2. John Burley, oops, I'm reading the background information again. Question 2 has to do with our background info, but it is, how old was John Burley when this account was published? So you're going to have to do a little bit of math. How old was John Burley when this account was published? Question 3. Why did John Burley not tell the truth about life working in the mill to the inspectors? And I will give you a clue. If you look in this paragraph down here, you'll find your answer. Why did John Burley not tell the truth? Now, we're going to compare this document, document C, with our documents from Wednesday. So if you need to pull those up in Canvas, that might be helpful. So which document, A or B, does this account more closely match, and why? So do you think this story about John Burley more closely matches with, do you think it more closely matches with A, Dr. Ward, who went into the factory and experienced it, or B, Dr. Holm, who told some tall tales and maybe lied a little bit? And make sure you give me the second part and tell me why. All right, let's move on to document D. Here's some background info. Edward Baines was a newspaper journalist and editor for the Leeds Mercury newspaper. In 1830s, he was elected to Parliament and served on their as a political liberal. Although Baines supported the end of slavery and various political reforms, he opposed legislation regulating factories and extending voting rights to the English working class. These are excerpts from his book, History of the Cotton Manufacture in Great Britain. So, Edward Baines, he was a journalist, he wrote for a newspaper. He was also part of government, but he did not want he didn't want factories to have to follow rules. He said they can treat people however they want. So here's that excerpt. Above all, it is alleged that the children who labor in mills are often cruelly beaten by overlookers, that their feeble limbs become distorted by continual standing and stooping, that in many mills they are forced to work 13, 14, or 15 hours per day, and that they have no time either for play or for education. Factory inspectors who have visited nearly every mill in the country have proved that views mentioned above of labor in factory mills contain a very small portion of truth. It is definitely true that there have been instances of abuse and cruelty in some factories, but abuse is the exception, not the rule. Factory labor is far less injurious than many of the most common jobs of civilized life. The human frame is liable to an endless variety of diseases. Many of the children who are born into the world and attain an age of 10 or 12 years are so weak that under any circumstances they would die early. Such children would sink under factory labor, as they would under any other kind of labor, or even without labor. I am not saying that factories are the most agreeable and healthy places, or that they have not been abused in them, which require exposure and correction. It must be admitted that the hours of labor in cotton mills are long, being 12 hours a day on 5 days a week and 9 hours on Saturday. But the work is light and requires very little muscular exertion. It is scarcely possible for any job to be lighter. The position of the body is not injurious. The children walk about and have opportunity to sit down frequently if they want to. On visiting mills, I have noticed the coolness and calmness of the work people, even the children, whose attitudes are positive and not anxious or gloomy. So here is our first question. So who wrote this article and when was it written? So if you look at the very bottom, it's about to get covered by my mouse, but if you look at the very, very bottom, it tells us who wrote it and when. It gives us the year. Who wrote it and when? Second question, why did Baines write this article? So another way to phrase this, did he think factories were safe or did he think factories were unsafe? Did he think factories were safe or did he think factories were unsafe? What was his message? Our next question, what does he mean in the second paragraph when he says abuse is the exception, not the rule? Abuse is the exception, not the rule. So is he saying abuse happens all the time or abuse happens sometimes? What is he saying? And our final question about document D, what is his main point in the final paragraph? So I want you to reread this final paragraph and tell me the main idea, the gist of this paragraph. Now we're going to compare this document, document D, to A and B from Wednesday. Which document most closely matches the one we just read and why? Which document, A or B, so Dr. Ward or Dr. Holmes, more closely matches this story we just read? And why? Explain your answer. And finally, we're going to compare C and D. So Burley is document C and Blaine is document D. Which document do you find more trustworthy and why? So do you think Burley's story, document C, is more trustworthy? Or do you think document D, Blaine's article, is more trustworthy? And tell me why.